The room held the weight of 3 days of stagnant air. It smelled of scorched coffee grounds and the sharp, metallic tang of unwashed nerves. Every surface was cluttered, but the focus remained on the sofa. The kid sat there, a frantic knot of tension, his fingers drumming a rapid, uneven rhythm against his knees. He shifted every few seconds, his eyes darting toward the window, then back to the door, never settling. The floorboards creaked under his constant twitching movement. Outside, the world was dim, but in here, the air felt thick enough to swallow sound. Kai sat in his fishing chair, a silent, unmoving anchor in the center of the chaos. He did not lean back. He did not look away. He watched the kid with a steady, fixed gaze, waiting for the inevitable spill of words. The silence in the room was not empty. It was a physical barrier, vibrating with the kid's mounting panic. Kai's hands remained clasped over his lap, knuckles white, his posture rigid. It was the only thing in the room that did not tremble. The kid opened his mouth to speak, then snapped it shut, his breathing hitching in the tight, heavy space. The words spilled out in a jagged rush. The kid talked about his father, his voice rising and falling in unnatural intervals. He spoke of the cartel, of black sedans idling at the end of every street, and of faces he kept seeing in the reflections of shop windows. His hands clawed at his hair, pulling at the roots with each mention of a new threat. He was convinced the walls were listening, that his phone was a beacon for men who did not leave witnesses. He leaned forward, eyes wide and bloodshot, recounting a deal that went south in a warehouse near the docks. He mimicked the sound of a pistol slide racking back, a sharp, sudden click that echoed in the small room. Kai did not blink. He watched the kid's chest heave, the erratic rhythm of his breathing, and the way his pupils dilated with every paranoid delusion. The room seemed to shrink as the kid detailed his escape, his narrative weaving a web of fear that draped over the furniture and pooled on the floor. Kai sat motionless, a stone in a rising tide of madness. He offered no reassurance, no questions, just the steady, unwavering presence of a man who had seen the edge of the abyss and refused to look away. The kid's voice went thin, reaching a fever pitch, then suddenly broke into a ragged, desperate whisper. Kai did not respond with words. Instead, he reached out and slid a fresh mug of coffee across the scarred tabletop. The ceramic scraped against the wood, a sharp, grounding sound that cut through the kid's rambling. The coffee steamed, a thin ribbon of warmth rising into the stale air. As the kid stared at the mug, the periphery of the room began to change. Tiny, glowing filaments emerged from the wallpaper, tracing patterns that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent hum. They were intricate, spreading like veins across the plaster, visible only to Kai. He watched them bloom, their light casting a faint, emerald glow over his own hands. The voice of Yggdrasil stirred in his mind, a steady, melodic frequency that smoothed the jagged edges of the room's tension. It was not a sound, but a vibration, humming beneath the floorboards and behind the walls. Kai leaned back, his eyes tracking the movement of the roots as they anchored themselves to the corners of the ceiling. He felt the weight of the house sigh in response. The kid remained hunched over, unaware of the light, still clutching the mug as if it were a shield. Kai breathed in the metallic scent of the roots, his focus split between the shivering boy and the ancient, quiet strength now woven into the fabric of the room. The hours blurred into a singular, static loop. Night deepened, then refused to break. The kid stopped talking, but his eyes never left the corners of the room. He shifted his weight, his chair creaking against the floorboards, a rhythmic protest against the stillness. Kai remained anchored in place. He watched the glowing roots on the wall dim and flare, their pulse mirroring the slow, heavy rhythm of the house. Outside, the world held its breath. Time seemed to thicken, pressing against the glass, refusing to move forward. The coffee in the mugs turned cold, a film forming on the dark surface. Kai did not move. He simply waited, his presence a steady gravity holding the room together. Slowly, the heavy curtain of night began to fray. A sliver of pale, watery light touched the edge of the windowsill. It crept across the floor, cold and unforgiving, signaling the end of the long vigil. The kid blinked, his eyelids heavy, his jaw finally relaxing its locked grip. The shadows in the room retreated, driven back by the creeping morning. The sun bled through the fabric, casting long, thin bars of light across the carpet. The kid took a shallow, uneven breath, and for the first time in 40 hours, he stopped shaking. Kai stood up, his joints popping in the sudden quiet of the morning. The kitchen floor felt cold beneath his feet. He moved to the stove, the blue flame flickering to life with a sharp hiss. He poured water into a small pot and measured out the rice, his movements precise and practiced. The smell of steam began to fill the cramped space, mixing with the lingering scent of stale coffee. Kai opened a tin of tuna, the metal lid pulling back with a jagged screech. He folded the fish into the warm rice, the steam rising in lazy curls. He did not look at the boy, who sat slumped on the sofa, his hands finally resting flat on his knees. Kai walked across the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and set the bowl down on the low table. He pushed it forward, a simple offer of sustenance. The boy looked at the bowl, then back at Kai. He reached out, his fingers trembling only slightly, and took a slow, deliberate bite. The warmth of the food hit him, a physical anchor pulling him back from the edge. He chewed slowly, his gaze losing its sharp, frantic edge. The room grew still. The tremors in his hands ceased, replaced by a heavy, exhausted calm. The boy scraped the bottom of the bowl, the sound of the spoon against ceramic echoing in the small room. He set the empty dish aside and wiped his palms on his knees. The frantic twitching in his jaw had fully subsided. He looked at Kai, his eyes clear and steady, devoid of the frantic darting that had defined his arrival. Kai stood near the counter, watching as the boy pushed himself up from the sofa. The movement was fluid, lacking the jagged, defensive tension of the last 2 days. He walked toward the door, his gait heavy but rhythmic. Kai reached out, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe before he turned the deadbolt. The lock clicked with a clean, sharp sound. Kai pulled the door open, revealing the bright, harsh light of the morning hallway. The boy stepped out, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as he cleared the threshold. He took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the air of the corridor. He looked back once, gave a single, silent nod to Kai, and turned toward the stairs. He descended without looking back, his pace measured, carrying a quiet peace that had been absent until this moment. Kai watched him go until the sound of his footsteps faded into the distant hum of the building. Kai stood alone in the center of the room, his hand still resting on the wood of the doorframe. The silence of the apartment felt different now, heavy with the absence of the boy, but charged with a new, lingering energy. He pulled the door shut, the latch clicking into place with a definitive, hollow sound. He turned back toward the kitchen, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting long, dusty beams across the floor. He exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing as the weight of the last 40 hours ebbed away. He walked to the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. As he reached for the kettle, the air near the sink began to hum. It was a low, vibrating frequency that made the water in the glass tremble. The light in the room seemed to bend and warp around a single point. A flicker of silver light caught the edge of his vision, growing brighter, more defined. Within a heartbeat, the space was no longer empty. Yggdrasil stood there, framed by the pale morning glow. She leaned against the counter, draped in his oversized hoodie, her silver hair catching the shifting sunbeams. She looked at him, her presence absolute, as if she had always been waiting just beneath the surface of the room. Yggdrasil reached for the instrument resting on the granite. It was a sleek electric violin, its surface dark and cool to the touch. She tucked it under her chin, her movements precise and fluid. The bow hovered for a heartbeat, then made contact with the strings. The first note did not merely sound, it radiated. It was a warm, golden vibration that seemed to ripple through the air, turning the stagnant morning light into something rich and honeyed. She drew the bow across the strings in long, sweeping strokes. The melody was not complex, but it was absolute. It filled the corners of the kitchen, softening the hard edges of the cabinets and smoothing over the silence left by the boy's departure. With every pass of the bow, the tension in the walls seemed to dissipate. The hum of the roots, previously a constant thrumming pressure, began to harmonize with the music. It was a sound of restoration, a frequency that anchored the room in a state of quiet, divine order. Kai stood motionless, watching the way the silver light clung to the motion of her arm. The music pulsed, a rhythmic, golden tide that washed away the remnants of the night, leaving behind only the steady, comforting thrum of her presence. The final note of the violin hung in the air, vibrating against the window glass before dissolving into the quiet hum of the apartment. Kai leaned back against the kitchen counter, his spine curving as his energy began to wane. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the deep, rhythmic pulse of exhaustion behind his eyes. Yet, as he looked toward the door where the boy had exited hours before, the corners of his mouth lifted. He saw the boy not as a broken stranger, but as a student who had stepped back from the abyss. He whispered the word into the silence, Padawan. The term felt heavy, grounding him in a purpose that transcended the simple act of providing shelter. He had watched the boy shed the paranoia that once defined his every movement, a transformation that required more than just food and rest. It required a witness. Kai stood in the center of the kitchen, his posture shifting from the rigid stance of a protector to the softer, weary relief of a man who had successfully held the line. He traced the grain of the countertop with a calloused thumb, his smile lingering. He had guided a soul back from the edge, and in that quiet, solitary victory, he felt the weight of his own commitment solidify. The room was still, but the air felt clearer, purged of the chaos that had occupied it for 2 days. Yggdrasil moved across the floor, her steps silent against the wood. She drifted into his space, the air around her cooling, and settled her head against his shoulder. The contact was deliberate, a steady pressure that forced Kai to exhale a breath he had been holding for years. As she pressed against him, the quiet of the room seemed to stretch, pulling the focus inward. Kai stared at the blank wall, his gaze unfocused. He felt the phantom weight of the past shifting within his own thoughts. For 13 years, the ghost of an ex-partner had occupied the corners of his mind, a persistent, jagged static he called the bug. It was a presence that had dictated his reactions, colored his memories, and left him constantly bracing for an impact that never came. He felt the cold memory of that presence now, a residual hum in his nervous system. Yggdrasil remained motionless, her hand resting on his arm, acting as an anchor against the tide of those old recollections. The ghost was still there, a thin, fraying shadow at the edge of his consciousness, but the grip was loosening. He stood in the dim morning, balanced between the man he had been and the quiet space he was slowly reclaiming. The 13-year cycle of interference was finally beginning to break. Kai pulled away from the wall, the warmth of the moment dissolving as he turned his attention to the closet. He reached into the dark corner, pulling out a heavy canvas bag. He set it on the table with a dull thud. Inside were the spray cans, their weight familiar and cold against his palms. He lined them up on the kitchen surface, checking the nozzles for blockages, his movements efficient and stripped of hesitation. Each rattle of the mixing ball inside the metal canisters sounded sharp in the quiet apartment. He wiped the caps clean with a rag, ensuring no dried pigment would clog the flow later. The air in the room felt different now, charged with the necessity of the coming hours. He checked the seal on his heavy-duty mask, confirming the filter was locked in place. He moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle, checking the bag one last time to ensure every color was accounted for. Outside, the sky was a deep, starless void, offering the perfect cover for the work that lay ahead. He stepped over the threshold, the cool night air hitting his face. He walked toward the council estate, his stride steady, the bag bumping against his hip with every step. The time for reflection had passed. The time for the mark had begun. Kai stood before the massive brick wall at the edge of the estate. The surface was rough, weathered by decades of rain and neglect. He set his heavy bag down on the pavement and unzipped it, the metal zipper rasping in the silence. He pulled out a single can, shook it until the mixing ball rattled a frantic, metallic rhythm, and then set it aside. He reached for a wire brush from his side pocket and began to scrub a section of the brick. Grit and dust puffed into the air, settling on his gloves. He wiped the wall clean with a damp cloth, checking the texture under his fingertips. It was ready. He retrieved the first can, pulled the cap off, and held the nozzle steady. His thumb pressed down. The hiss was sharp, immediate, and hungry. A thin, vibrant line of pigment bled onto the brick, stark against the drab mortar. He moved his hand in a slow, deliberate arc, following a pattern etched into his memory. The paint clung to the surface, beginning to pulse with a faint, unnatural luminance. He leaned in closer, his breathing synchronized with the steady hiss of the spray, as the outline of a root system began to take shape against the dark masonry. A low rumble vibrated through the pavement, the distinct, rhythmic thrum of an EU patrol vehicle turning into the neighboring street. Kai froze, his hand still gripping the paint can. He looked up toward the roofline. Yggdrasil was already there, a silhouette against the dim sky. She sat with her legs swinging over the edge, her electric violin pressed firmly against her shoulder. As the headlights of the patrol car swept across the far end of the alley, she drew the bow across the strings. A sharp, dissonant note pierced the air, immediately softening into a complex, shimmering melody that seemed to ripple outward. The patrol car slowed. The driver paused, head tilting as if listening to a radio station that did not exist. The headlights flickered, the beams distorting and bending away from the brick wall as if hitting a wall of glass. The agents inside the vehicle exchanged confused glances, their eyes glazing over. They did not see the mural. They did not see the man standing in the shadows. The vehicle accelerated, the engine whine fading back into the distance, leaving the alley in a heavy, unnatural silence. Yggdrasil did not stop playing. The music hung in the air like a shroud, keeping the world at bay while Kai remained invisible in the dark. Kai did not look back. He swapped the first can for a second, then a third, his hands moving in a blur of rhythmic precision. He no longer needed to measure the space. The wall seemed to reach out to meet the spray. As he swept the nozzle across the rough surface, the pigment took on a life of its own. It pooled and branched, thickening into veins that pulsed with a deep, subterranean light. The tree was no longer just paint. It was a living structure expanding before his eyes. He stepped back, then lunged forward to fill a gap as the trunk surged upward, climbing toward the roofline. Every stroke was a strike of intent. He moved along the base, his boots scuffing the pavement as he traced the sprawling, gnarled roots that burrowed deep into the mortar. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and wet earth. He shifted his grip, his fingers working the pressure-sensitive nozzle to create depth and shadow in the bark. The tree was massive now, its silhouette dominating the alleyway, glowing with a soft, persistent radiance that pushed back the surrounding dark. He was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, but he did not slow down. The rhythm of his breath matched the steady, pulsing light of the mural, his body acting as the conduit for the tree to take root in the stone. Kai dipped his chin, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. The trunk was finished, but the canvas demanded more. He reached for a fresh canister, the nozzle hissing as he sprayed a perfect, geometric circle. Within the circle, a solar symbol ignited, the paint catching a light that seemed to originate from beneath the bricks. He moved to the left, his hand tracing a series of interconnected hearts that throbbed with a rhythmic, golden luminescence. Every line he drew seemed to lock into place, vibrating against the stone. The wall was no longer just a surface. It was becoming a living map, a reflection of the architecture within his mind. He added a flare of amber pigment, and the symbols began to drift, rearranging themselves into constellations that pulsed in time with the violin music from above. He stepped back, his eyes tracking the way the light bled into the surrounding shadows, turning the cold alley into a sanctuary of warmth. The symbols were not static. They shifted and breathed, glowing with an intensity that made the very air feel electric. He watched as a heart glowed brighter, casting a soft, amber hue across the ground, mapping out a path of memory and intention. The mural was alive, a testament to the bond he had forged, glowing with the brilliance of a sun trapped in stone. Kai stood motionless, his breath hitching as the mural settled. The symbols pulsed with a steady, heartbeat rhythm, but the center remained blank, waiting for the final key. He reached into his kit and pulled out a canister of specialized iridescent pigment. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the gravity of the moment. He pressed the nozzle. The first letter, Y, hissed onto the cold brick, glowing with a fierce silver light that seemed to cut through the alley gloom. He moved with deliberate care, forming each character as if carving it into his own skin, G-G-D-R-A-S-I-L. The paint shimmered, bubbling with an inner heat that defied the laws of physics. As he finished the final stroke, the name flared, a blinding beacon of identity against the darkness. The wall groaned, the mortar settling as if accepting the weight of the spirit now anchored to it. Kai dropped the empty can. It clattered against the pavement, the sound sharp and final. The name burned with a steady, radiant intensity. A permanent declaration carved in light. He stepped back, his hands stained with the glowing residue, watching as the letters hummed in sympathy with the roots of the tree. The bond was no longer a secret. It was written in stone. High above on the roof, the bow hit the strings with a sudden, frantic speed. The melody shifted from a lullaby to a sharp, aggressive staccato that seemed to vibrate the very bricks of the estate. Kai looked up, seeing Yggdrasil's silhouette framed against the moonless sky. Below, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the street corner EU agents, their flashlights cutting through the haze. Kai did not move. He watched as the music intensified, the notes creating a visible distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. The agents reached the alley entrance, their lights sweeping across the brickwork, yet they passed right over the glowing mural as if it were nothing more than a blank, shadow-filled wall. The violin screamed in a final, piercing crescendo. The sound waves rippled outward, forming a translucent, shimmering dome that encapsulated the mural and the alley. Inside the shield, the world felt heavy, charged with static. The light from the painting bled into the air, swirling with the violin's resonance until the physical space seemed to fold inward. The agents slowed, paused, and then turned away, their eyes glazed, their purpose forgotten. The music held the line, locking the spiritual manifestation behind a wall of pure, golden sound. The final note of the violin hung in the air, vibrating against the wet brick. Kai remained frozen, his eyes locked on the mural. The paint was no longer drying, it was shifting. The edges of the world tree began to soften, the pigment bleeding into the mortar with a slow, rhythmic expansion. A faint, otherworldly light emanated from the core of the tree, pulsating like a slow-beating heart. Kai reached out, his fingertips hovering an inch from the surface, and he felt a distinct, cool resistance, a hum of energy pushing back against his skin. The wall was no longer just a surface. It had become a membrane between two worlds. Light flowed through the painted roots, liquid and golden, illuminating the damp alley with a soft, bioluminescent glow that defied the surrounding darkness. Every symbol Kai had sprayed now flickered in sequence, a silent language communicating with the very foundation of the estate. The air grew thick, smelling of ozone and crushed leaves. He pulled his hand back, watching as the light deepened, turning the brickwork into a translucent window of energy. The seal was taking hold, anchoring itself into the architecture of the city. It was no longer a mural, it was a living, breathing sentinel, watching over the shadows. Kai stepped back, his boots crunching on loose gravel. His breath hitched as the mural reached its final state of equilibrium. The glowing pigments stopped their erratic pulsing, settling into a steady, soft radiance that bathed the narrow alley in a calm, amber hue. The entire wall seemed to solidify, the brickwork no longer feeling like porous clay but like something dense, reinforced by unseen forces. He watched closely as the edges of the world tree merged perfectly with the surrounding mortar, erasing the boundaries between art and architecture. The hum in the air dropped an octave, shifting from a sharp vibration to a low, comforting thrum that settled deep in his chest. Yggdrasil ceased her playing, the sudden silence amplifying the newfound stillness of the space. Kai felt the connections snap into place, a heavy, absolute finality that anchored the sanctuary against the chaos of the city beyond. The alleyway was no longer just a passage, it was a fortress of light. He wiped his hands on his trousers, the spray paint cold against his skin, and looked at the name glowing at the base of the trunk. It was fixed. The bond was sealed. He turned his back to the wall, knowing that whatever happened in the streets outside, this threshold would hold firm. The radiance from the wall did not stop at the brickwork. It bled into the pavement, tracing the cracks in the concrete with thin, glowing veins of light. Kai watched, as the luminescence climbed the adjacent structures, wrapping the entire corner of the estate in a subtle, protective embrace. The oppressive atmosphere of the neighborhood, once heavy with the weight of urban decay, began to thin. The air lost its stagnant, metallic edge, replaced by a crispness that felt like the morning after a storm. Windows that had been dark for weeks flickered with a soft, steady rhythm, responding to the frequency of the mural. Down the street, a stray cat paused, ears twitching toward the wall, before settling into the warmth of the glowing shadows. The silence of the night was no longer empty. It was pregnant with a new, quiet authority. Kai walked to the edge of the alley, his eyes tracing the way the light wove through the dark architecture of the council houses. The estate was changing. The geometry of the streets felt different, aligned to a new center. He stood in the middle of the road, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, synced perfectly with the heartbeat of the tree. The transformation was complete. The sanctuary had claimed its territory. Kai stepped through the threshold of his apartment, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. The air inside felt heavy, stagnant with the residue of years he was now leaving behind. He did not sit. He did not rest. He moved straight to the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over the surfaces that held the dust of his former life. He filled a bucket with steaming water, the steam rising in lazy curls toward the ceiling. He began with the tabletops. He scrubbed until the wood grain groaned under the friction, removing the sticky film of old coffee and forgotten stress. Every circular motion of the cloth was a deliberate act of erasure. He moved to the windows, clearing the grime that had dulled the morning light. He found a stubborn grease stain on the stove and worked at it with a wire brush, the rhythmic scratching filling the silence of the room. His hands were raw, but his focus was singular. He replaced the curtains, shaking out the dust of a decade. He wiped down the shelves until they shone, stripping away the layers of neglect. The apartment was shedding its skin. By the time he reached the final corner of the living area, the space felt lighter, stripped to its foundation, ready for the change he had promised himself. The apartment was now a vacuum of order, every surface polished to a mirror finish. Kai moved to the medicine cabinet, the last relic of his unresolved history. He opened the mirrored door, his eyes landing on a small, sealed container tucked in the back. Inside lay a single, blood-stained plaster. It was a jagged, yellowed thing crusted with the dried remnants of a struggle that had defined his bitterness for 13 years. He picked it up with a pair of surgical tweezers. The plastic felt brittle, holding the static charge of a decade of resentment. He did not look away. He examined the dark smear, acknowledging the pain it represented without letting it pull him back into the cycle. Beside him, a small red linen bag sat open on the vanity. The fabric was rough, woven with tight, protective fibers. He dropped the plaster inside. The sound of the plastic hitting the bottom was dull and final. He pulled the silk drawstrings, cinching the bag closed until the knot was tight. He held it in his palm, feeling the weight shift as the object settled. The trauma was no longer a part of the room. It was contained. He set the bag on the nightstand, walked to the window, and opened the latch to let the morning air wash away the last of the stagnant scent. The park was alive with the morning hum of the city, the grass thick and damp underfoot. Kai set his tripod on the flat gravel path, framing the camera lens toward the statue in the center of the clearing. Batman stood ready, his posture stiff, waiting for the signal to move. Kai checked the exposure, his fingers dancing over the dials with practiced ease. A sudden gust of wind caught the reflector, sending it tumbling across the lawn. The chute halted. Kai watched the metal frame bounce, then stepped forward to retrieve it. He did not curse. He did not tighten his jaw. He simply picked up the reflector, wiped the dirt from its surface, and looked over at the camera. A genuine smile broke across his face as he signaled for a restart. The tension of the past years seemed to evaporate into the trees. He shouted directions, his voice ringing out with a lightness that felt foreign yet entirely his own. He moved around the set, showing Batman how to shift his weight to catch the light. When the first successful take wrapped, Kai let out a laugh that traveled through the park, audible over the rustling leaves. He was no longer reacting to shadows. He was creating, and for the first time, he was entirely present in the work. The council estate was quiet when Kai arrived, the brick wall looming in the shadows of the alley. He found the cousin waiting by the base of the wall, a stack of spray cans arranged at his feet. They stood for a moment, the air between them thick with the residue of old grievances. Kai held out a canister of deep ochre, his gaze steady. The cousin took it, a slow nod passing between them, the past grievances dissolving into the shared necessity of the work. They began at the corners, moving with rhythmic, synchronized motions. The cousin added intricate geometric patterns while Kai filled the centers with protective solar sigils. The hiss of the spray was the only sound, a steady, rhythmic pulse that filled the narrow space. They worked until their knuckles were stained with pigment and the wall was transformed into a vibrant shield. Every line was deliberate, every symbol etched with the intent to guard the space. When they stepped back, the mural seemed to vibrate against the bricks. They stood side by side, looking at the sprawling world tree, the protective geometry glowing in the dim light. The tension that had defined their relationship for years was gone, replaced by the weight of their finished work. They left the cans in a neat row, the wall now a silent, immovable sentry. The market stalls were already heavy with the scent of spices and damp earth as Kai walked the narrow path back toward the estate. He kept his head low, feeling the lingering weight of the spray paint on his fingertips. A group of market elders sat on wooden crates near the entrance, their hands resting on their knees. Watching the flow of the crowd, Kai slowed his pace, bracing for the usual scrutiny. As he passed, the chatter of the market seemed to dampen, held in check by the quiet authority of the elders. One of them, a man with deep lines etched into his face, stood up slowly. He looked toward the direction of the mural, then back at Kai. He did not speak. Instead, he gave a slow, deliberate nod that rippled through the rest of the group. The tension that usually clung to the corners of the market had vanished, replaced by a strange, humming stability. The air felt cleaner, sharper, as if the protective sigils on the wall were radiating outward, shielding the neighborhood from the chaos of the streets. Kai returned the nod, a brief, respectful dip of his chin. He walked on, and behind him he heard the market return to its rhythm. But it was different now. The atmosphere had shifted. The peace he had worked to manifest was taking root, and the elders, keepers of the neighborhood pulse, acknowledged the change. Kai climbed the final step to his apartment, his body heavy with the fatigue of the last few days. He pushed the door open, expecting the familiar stillness of his own space, but the air met him differently. It was thick, sweet, and unmistakable. The scent of crushed guava hung in the room, warm and cloying, clinging to the curtains and the worn fabric of his chair. He moved to the bedroom, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He pulled the duvet back, his movements slow, deliberate, driven by a deep need for silence. As he settled into the bed, the temperature in the room shifted. A faint hum began to vibrate in the floor, not loud, but insistent, like the sound of a distant hive. He stared at the empty space beside the bed, his pulse slowing to match the rhythm of the house. Then, the air began to thicken and coil. A shadow detached itself from the wall, sharpening into form, becoming more solid with every passing second. Yggdrasil appeared. She did not shimmer or fade. She arrived with a weight that displaced the air around her. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the springs dipping under her presence. Her skin felt warm, a stark contrast to the chill of the night outside. She looked at him, her gaze anchoring him to the present, and the scent of guava intensified, wrapping around the room like a physical blanket. Kai lay still, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, but his mind was elsewhere. The old ghost was there, a jagged knot of memory that had tightened in his chest for 13 long years. It felt like a cold, metal wire winding around his ribs, a constant, abrasive friction that colored every thought. He closed his eyes, but the sensation only intensified, a phantom weight pulling at his breath. Yggdrasil moved closer. Her presence was a steady anchor in the dark. She reached out, her fingers pressing firmly against the center of his chest. The contact was immediate and transformative. Where her palm rested, the coldness began to thaw. The jagged edges of the memory softened, vibrating under the pressure of her touch. It was not a sudden erasure, but a slow, rhythmic unraveling. He felt the tension bleed out of his muscles, replaced by a low, humming frequency that vibrated through his marrow. The bitterness that had defined his internal landscape for over a decade began to lose its shape, dissolving into the warmth of her energy. The wire snapped, not with a sound, but with a silent, total release. The internal turbulence smoothed into a flat, clear calm, and for the first time in years, the space behind his ribs felt quiet, open, and entirely his own. The space where the ghost had lived was now empty. Kai exhaled, a long, ragged sound that seemed to pull the last of the tension out of the room. He remained motionless, testing the silence. It held. There was no sharpness, no sudden return of the old friction, only a clean, open stillness. Yggdrasil shifted her weight. The mattress gave a soft, rhythmic protest under her movement as she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Her presence was absolute, a steady heat that eclipsed the shadows still clinging to the corners of the ceiling. She did not speak. She didn't need to. She lowered her head until her face was inches from his, her eyes fixed on his with a weight that felt like an unbreakable promise. She tilted her head, her breath cool against his skin. Then, she pressed her lips against his forehead. The touch was firm, grounding, and final. It was a seal. In that moment, the last traces of the 13-year haunt vanished, burned away by the contact. He felt the phantom pressure in his mind collapse, replaced by a singular, focused clarity. She held the kiss, her skin temperature regulating his own, anchoring him to the physical world. The transition was complete. The ghost was gone, and the room grew utterly still, waiting for what would follow. She pulled back just enough so their gazes locked, the intensity of her focus unwavering. Yggdrasil leaned in, her lips hovering near his ear. She whispered of a life yet to be, a sequence of days built on the foundation of what they had just reclaimed. The words were soft, yet they carried a weight that vibrated through the mattress and into the floorboards. As she spoke, the room underwent a silent transformation. Beneath the wallpaper, the glowing roots surged, pulsing with a rhythmic, golden light that mapped the walls. They were no longer just marks of protection. They were the infrastructure of his new existence. Kai watched the lights flicker, their steady beat matching the slowing rhythm of his own heart. The fatigue finally claimed him, no longer a heavy burden, but a soft, enveloping shroud. He felt the roots beneath the house deepening, digging into the earth, securing the space against the reach of the outside world. His eyelids grew heavy, the image of the glowing walls blurring into a warm, amber haze. He did not fight the descent. He let the promise hold him, a tether to the ground as his consciousness slipped away. The house settled around them, the roots locked deep, and Kai fell into a sleep so profound it felt like the first breath of a new life. The room remained held in the amber glow of the roots. Kai's breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmic. Matching the pulse of the living walls, Yggdrasil sat at the edge of the bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She reached for the electric violin resting against the nightstand. She did not play a song of battle or memory. She drew the bow across the strings with a light, feather touch, coaxing out a melody that felt like distant sunlight on water. The sound was thin and crystalline, weaving through the stillness of the apartment. It carried no edges, no demands, only a quiet, resonant peace. She watched the melody ripple through the air, softening the harsh lines of the furniture and the dark corners of the ceiling. Slowly, she eased the pressure of the bow, the notes thinning until they were little more than a vibration in the quiet air. The final chord hung for a heartbeat before dissolving into the shadows. Yggdrasil set the instrument down. The room fell into a profound, heavy silence, a stillness so absolute it felt like a sanctuary. Outside, the world continued its frantic spin, but here, the roots held fast. The air stood perfectly still. The mission was done. All that remained was the quiet and the grace of a life reclaimed.